It was the summer of 1950, and I lived in suburban Houston. I was playing in the backyard in the sandbox with Ralph and Peter and Barbara. And not too many days later, Ralph came down with polio. Nobody knew where the virus came from. We were all really scared to death of it. So my father decided the virus must have lived in the sand. So he destroyed the sandbox.
The story of polio is the story of how fear changed America. It began on any given summer's day when a child would call out, "Mama, I can't move my leg."
I had just turned 13. I'd had a big slumber party a week before, which was really kind of a scary thing to have because it was polio season, but it was the end of polio season. So parents were more relaxed and more willing to let girls get together.
And toward the end of the summer, we were out at Kensington. As we got up to leave that day and we were packing up and heading toward the parking lot, I suddenly got very dizzy and disoriented and actually bumped right into a parking sign.
We were out playing touch football field, and I noticed my right leg just sort of was weak and would buckle under me. It wasn't until that evening when I was marching in the polio benefit parade that I became ill and the weakness in my legs became more pronounced, and I finally had to drop out of the march and sit on the curb.
For 48 hours, I didn't sleep. I was in agony, and that my neck was very stiff. My spine was aching. I mean, I had terrible pain, and every step I took was would radiate through me, up and down my body.
He got me into the car. It was on a very beautiful fall day, and I took a long look around the farm. I very much loved the farm, enjoyed growing up there, and thought to myself, I better look around. I may not be back here for a while.
America at the start of the century thought itself the most progressive place on earth, where opportunities were unlimited and people could shape their own destinies. Science and technology were the key to man's conquest of disease and control over nature. While people still died of old threats like cholera and diphtheria, these diseases were understood. Polio was different. Polio is ancient, and people have contracted it for thousands of years all over the world. But it wasn't headline news in America until the summer of 1916. First, the symptoms mimicked a cold, with a headache, often a chill, and then, sometimes, paralysis. The effect might be as mild as a stiff joint or as severe as total paralysis of the arms, the legs, even the whole body. Those whose muscles for breathing or swallowing were hit often died. Doctors had seen this disease before, but never as bad as this. Because it had always seemed to affect only children, the disease was called infantile paralysis. The medical textbooks said poliomyelitis. Like a familiar neighborhood bully, it eventually demanded a nickname: polio. For a decade, better sanitation had steadily driven down many killers like typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis. So when alarming numbers of new polio cases came in, public health authorities responded the way they always had. New York City officials doused the streets with 4 million gallons of water a day and killed 72,000 stray cats. Polio cases continued to climb. Health authorities couldn't agree on the right approach, and the public knew it. This fed a growing hysteria about the epidemic. Who was to blame? New York City's slums teemed with immigrants. They were different. The new Italian and East European immigrants especially were easy to blame. Their habits seemed strange and their neighborhoods were dirty. That middle-class New Yorkers who never went near the slums got polio made no difference. That Americans far from New York also got polio, no difference. People became panicked by the terrible germ and its unknown carrier. Thousands fled the city. But the word was out that infected New Yorkers were coming. No one wanted to be near children who might have polio. In 1916, almost everything about polio was unknown to medicine. Scientists believed a mysterious virus entered the nose and traveled a few inches to the brain. There, it attacked the central nervous system. The best authorities agreed on this view. When the long summer of 1916 passed, the temperature dropped, and so did the disease. Across America, 27,000 people, mostly children, had caught polio, and 6,000 had died. The crippled ones, however, remained. They lived in places like the Home for Incurables and the Society for the Ruptured and Crippled. Even the well-off were confined to back rooms, isolated, out of sight, in the love and shame of their families. Bad enough to be crippled, worse to be a constant reminder.
We didn't know where it came from.
Every block had kids down sick.
It was a big scare.
It was an act of God.
We didn't know how to prevent it.
There was no vaccine.
It was very frightening.
There was no cure.
I was a dancer and I'd been to school since I was 3. One of the attending physicians, I guess it said on my chart that I danced. And he just twirled me around the floor. He wasn't a very good dancer, but that was the last time I danced.
At the hospital, I was put in quarantine in a little Quonset hut out back. The paralysis increased, climbed up my body over the next day and a half, until finally I was completely paralyzed, unable to move anything.
Envision a hospital room that probably should have had 6 beds in it with perhaps 18 beds or 20 beds. We were side by side. We had bed partners, but we were all too ill to notice even who was next to us.
The hospital workers were either so busy or not keen on coming into a room where there was such contagion that they would not come in. I wouldn't have much contact with any humans.
I remember that I did a lot of crying. I think when I was awake, I cried constantly.
My parents came to see me during my stay in Contagion, and they would have to stand outside of my bedroom in the parking lot. The nurse would come and open my window about not even an inch, just a tiny crack, so that you could hear. I could hear her and them, they could hear me. And I remember every day that they did come, my mother would insist that I lift my head, and I couldn't. That I raise my arms, and I did. My arms weren't too terribly affected. And then I raised my legs, and each day I did. And then one day, my right leg didn't raise more than this, no matter how hard I tried. And she started crying again. And she turned away, and I remember being so frightened. But not just so frightened, but feeling like I'd let her down so bad.
The year after the epidemic of 1916, there were very few polio cases, and in the next years, even fewer. It was easy to think the worst was over. Then, in August 1921, on a wooded island off the coast of Maine, a man fell ill, and the fate of polio was forever changed. Franklin D. Roosevelt had traveled from hot, humid Washington, D.C. to attend a Boy Scout rally on the Hudson River. Then, tired out, but glad to be back at the family's summer home, he took his children sailing. They swam in the icy water. They raced on the shore. Still in a wet bathing suit, he read through his mail. He felt chilled and went to bed. On August 11th, he awoke with an odd weakness in his right knee. That evening, the left knee gave way. By the following morning, he could not use his legs. Franklin Roosevelt never walked again. Through both his mother and father, Roosevelt was a patrician with money and influence. He had been Undersecretary of the Navy and his party's nominee for Vice President. He was 39, and with his wealth, power, and ambition, the future never looked brighter. Until polio. He never regarded his paralysis as permanent. He devoted 7 years to trying to regain the use of his legs. On the suggestion of an acquaintance, he visited Warm Springs, Georgia, a thermal spa for the well-to-do. Warm Springs had seen better days. Roosevelt's wife Eleanor judged it derelict, but he immediately felt comfortable there. Using nearly 2/3 of his wealth, he bought it. From all over the country, polio patients came to try Dr. Roosevelt's warm water cure. Here, no one felt ashamed or self-conscious. The very existence of Warm Springs gave hope.
Roosevelt just dominated Warm Springs. He swam in the pool with the other polios. He went around to the wards, talked to everybody. He played bridge up in Georgia Hall with the patients. In Warm Springs, he was a polio with other polios and very comfortable. I was a New Deal kid, and I'd been for FDR my whole life. I'd campaigned for him at the age of 8, and I'd been a page at the 1944 convention that renominated him. I joined the demonstration, and in fact, it was the Roosevelts who helped me get into Warm Springs.
1, 2, 3.
And whenever I met anybody who had known Roosevelt down there, I always asked them, how did he handle his handicap? Because I thought if he could do it, I can do it. In terms of my rehabilitation, he was sort of my role model, that you just get up and go, and you just don't worry about what's happened to you, and you just don't talk about it. You get on with your life.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Roosevelt never did recover the use of his legs, yet he seemed to walk. He locked his leg braces, leaned on someone's arm, and thrust himself forward. His paralysis was not a secret. It had been announced on page 1 of the New York Times. But Roosevelt allowed no photographs of himself being helped or carried. The press cooperated in this. Only 2 private photos are known to exist of him in his wheelchair. The American public did not want to see a man in a wheelchair as president, so they didn't.
They pushed school dates back. We weren't allowed to play with friends.
My mother would not allow me to go to the candy store.
We never went swimming in August.
We were kept away from all crowds. We were forbidden to go to the movies.
It was a very long, lonely summer. Room 201 was down the end of the hall from Contagion, actually, and I remember being moved out of Contagion in the early afternoon, put into this room where there were a sea of beds.
Occasionally a man would come in with movies, sound movies, and the respirators would be moved around so we could all see the screen. We had entertainment, we had visits by personalities. First person I saw was Barbara Stanwyck.
I used to sing I Ain't Got No Use for the Women during the nursing circle.
Some of those nurses were the best. One of them brought peas in with straws so that we could see if we could hit the ceiling to increase our vital capacity.
When it was truly bedtime and I was tired, and they would turn off the lights and the nurse would leave the ward and everybody was in their own space, and you had this sound of these bellows for each different respirator that, the sound of, and they all kind of had their own sound, and sometimes working in tandem, there would almost be a music. It was an eerie orchestration.
I missed my home so much. I mean, they were going on with their life without me, and I really miss that.
Warm Springs may have been a mecca for polio patients, but it was steadily losing money. About to relaunch his political career, FDR could no longer concern himself with its operation. he turned to his old law partner, Basil O'Connor. "Here, you take it over," Roosevelt told his friend. O'Connor, a successful Wall Street lawyer, had never liked Warm Springs and was reluctant to head a charity, but he was fiercely loyal to Roosevelt, so he agreed. Soon, fighting polio became O'Connor's passion. High-handed, brash, and unrelenting, he began to do nothing less than use the prestige of the presidency to fight a germ. The first campaign was a series of annual balls pegged to Roosevelt's birthday. In the first year alone, 6,000 galas raised 10 times what O'Connor had anticipated. It was used for patient care at Warm Springs and to finance research into the cause and prevention of polio. "1931 had been another particularly bad epidemic year. While the iron lung had been invented to breathe for a patient with paralyzed respiratory muscles, only marginal progress had been made since 1916 towards understanding the virus. But now a growing number of doctors and scientists had set their sights on polio. It was challenging, it was important, and it promised glory to the man who cracked the code. What all these researchers sought was not a cure, but rather prevention, immunity to polio. Scientists had long known how to give the body certain immunities. The idea was to give a small, controlled exposure to the disease. That would prompt the body to build its own disease-fighting agents, antibodies. These antibodies in the bloodstream would protect against future disease, immunity. In 1935, Dr. John Colmer designed a vaccine he believed would give immunity to polio. The vaccine seemed to work on monkeys, so he took the next step. He injected children and distributed thousands of doses to other doctors around the country.
The majority of young children are apparently susceptible, and something must be done for their protection. In this connection, I am most happy about the prospects of safely vaccinating them at least over the period of their childhood.
The results were disastrous. Some children were paralyzed by the injection, and some died. Colmer and his colleagues may have had the right theory, but there was still too much they didn't know about polio. By 1938, the birthday balls had run their course, and O'Connor needed a fresh approach.
How do you like this for an idea? During the week of January 23rd,
Eddie
we'll ask
Cantor,
every
one of the
radio
nation's
star
most popular
to
entertainers,
ask their
coined the
listeners to send a
phrase,
dime to
the
the White
March
House.
of Dimes, a
With
wordplay on
50
the
million
famous movie
listeners,
newsreel series,
you can get
The March
$5
of Time.
million. Think of it. You can lick infantile paralysis with the March of Dimes.
It was democratic with a small d. Anyone, everyone could give a dime. A flood of silver choked the White House mailroom. From then on, charity and show business went hand in hand with the war on polio.
And I like a diamond change, too.
Are you saving him, Mickey?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to give mine to President Roosevelt.
President? Why, Mickey?
Yes, you see, Judy, I've got my envelope made out right here. It's all ready to go. See for yourself.
Oh, I know. It's a March of Dimes, the Infantile Paralysis Fund.
Join the March of Dimes. Send yours to President Franklin Roosevelt in the White House.
World War II. As the GIs went off to join the Allies, Basil O'Connor worried that the war effort would draw America's attention away from polio. Instead, polio became another front within the war. Albert Sabin, already established as an authority on polio, joined the medical corps assuming his research would be interrupted. But he soon found himself assigned to the Mideast, where the disease had mysteriously broken out among Allied troops. Few children in this part of the world ever contracted polio. So Sabin and his colleagues did not understand why an epidemic would break out among healthy young Americans. Clearly, the native population had some kind of immunity. What kind of immunity? Answering this question became critical to unlocking the secret of polio. But scientists were finally learning more about the virus, how it came into the body, not through the nose to the brain, but through the mouth into the digestive system. The carrier was intestinal waste, feces, and it could spread through the water supply, food handling, person-to-person contact. The virus itself could now be seen through the new electron microscope. With the centrifuge, it could be purified. And there were new approaches to rehabilitation. Elizabeth Kenny, an Australian nurse known as Sister Kenny, came to the United States to introduce her method of moist heat and repetitive exercises to rebuild paralyzed limbs. Her techniques revolutionized physical therapy for polio patients. All of these advances cost money, serious money. Basil O'Connor had to keep the level of public commitment high.
I am taking this opportunity to tell you something of a vital and unrelenting war that's being fought here on the home front. The forces of science and health carry on a perpetual offense in this struggle, for it is the war against disease.
Organization, paperwork, accountability, supplies, loyalty to the cause. The National Foundation worked like a smooth political machine. With so many men away at the war, O'Connor enlisted women for the front lines of his battle. It started with club women and soon became a disciplined army of volunteers. This was a grassroots organization with a national mission operating without any involvement from the federal government. The foundation controlled its own agenda, from making posters and armbands to ordering iron lungs, educating nurses, and funding research. The March of Dimes message was everywhere.
On a given night, they would actually stop the movies and turn on the lights and have people pass canisters up and down the aisle, just like going to church or something. And nobody complained.
In the western part of North Carolina, quite near the Great Smokies, lies the little town of Hickory. Last June, Hickory was dozing in the early summer sun, and then almost within the hour, fear and terror gripped the hearts of the people. For down from the hills came a case of infantile paralysis. Then came another, and another. The National Foundation took over a summer camp at Hickory and converted it into a hospital, and the battle against infantile paralysis was on. Then after days and nights of ceaseless, heartbreaking work, the fight was won, as you can see from these happy, smiling youngsters. Upon your kind hearts, upon the quarters and dimes and dollars that you give now in this theater, depends the happiness of some child somewhere tomorrow. So please, when the theater attendant comes to you, will you give whatever you wish? And for whatever you give, the children thank you.
Don't get overtired. Don't run around too much.
Never drink from somebody else's cup.
For some reason, all the adults blamed this creek.
The people in Kansas thought that they were somewhat immune.
Rich people didn't get infantile paralysis.
To get sick was sort of a weakness of character.
The treatment for polio was hot packs, and then some more hot packs.
Early in the morning, they come in with these machines that's steaming.
It was during summertime, and there was no air conditioning, and hot packs inside the iron lung was unbelievably difficult and annoying.
The therapist would sometimes get up on the table and put your leg up on their shoulder and pull with their hands on your knee to straighten out your leg and stretch the muscles. It was painful, and you yelled a lot sometimes.
The therapist would sit on a little stool with rollers on in front of us, and she would hold us up, and we would take that first halting step that we hadn't taken since the day we got polio.
The decade that followed the war brought the bright future for which Americans had long been waiting. There was an explosion of new comforts, appliances, cars, of suburbs, and babies. And an explosion, too, of polio. Polio had climbed steadily all throughout the World War. By the early 50s, the shadow of polio was falling across every town in America.
My name is virus poliomyelitis. I cause a disease which you call infantile paralysis. I consider myself quite an artist, a sort of sculptor. I specialize in grotesques, twisting and deforming human bodies. That's why I'm called the crippler.
Even with all the advances in science since the epidemic of 1916, only now were pieces of the polio puzzle coming slowly into focus. It turned out to be as simple and unexpected as a children's ghost story. In the world prior to our century, the crippler poliomyelitis lived everywhere. All of the children, rich and poor, black and white, had been exposed to him, but few had ever been felled by his dark shadow. Why? Because they had met him as infants, when they were still protected by the immunity, the antibodies they got from their mothers. The crippler was harbored in the sewers, and he passed from child to child, through food, water, and at play. Once they had battled the crippler with the antibodies from their mothers, they built their own immunity and possessed it for life. But then the doctors and scientists convinced everyone to clean their hands, their houses, and their water supply. Clean, they said, would make us healthier. And they were right. Mostly. Modern sanitation broke the link between children and disease. Many did not come into contact with the crippler until long after infancy, when their mother's protection had worn off. They grew from babies into children, and the crippler grabbed them in the heat of the summer, when the environment was right and he was at the peak of his strength. And some passed through childhood and into adulthood when the crippler struck and hit very, very hard. The worst part was no one knew who would be next. For every 100 people touched by the crippler, 95 never even knew, no symptoms at all. Maybe 3 or 4 got a sniffle, but 1 or 2 felt the sudden weakness, chill, and dizziness that led to paralysis or death.
Memorial Hospital, please. Infantile paralysis. Hello.
The bitter moral of the story was polio had come with progress. No one could be sure when the crippler's dark shadow would appear, nor where he would visit. So he terrorized a nation.
I feel very active today. I may even start an epidemic.
I was working in Mississippi in the year of 1946, and we had an epidemic there. The patients were coming from all around the state. Nurses were coming from all over the country. It was just a very desperate time. We would wipe their tears, we would wipe drool, we fed them, we brushed their hair, we bathed them, we took care of body eliminations, moved their fingers, positioned their hands. Some of them were paralyzed, you see.
The older the children were, the more angry they were, because by that time they seemed to realize, I can't move my arm or I can't move my leg, and a child gets angry because they can't do that. I can remember putting a child in braces from the hips down to their toes, and having them stand up, and they think, oh, it's so nice to be standing up, If a child was in a little child in an iron lung, it was, well, look at the funny house you're in.
These patients needed someone with them all the time. And because this was your assignment, you were there. It was just one of those very dramatic times in our history, I guess.
Black children were struck down as often as whites, but in the still racially segregated South, Black polio victims were turned away from hospitals and from warm springs and told to seek help elsewhere.
The problem with black care in the South was segregation, which existed within hospitals and doctors' offices and all the areas where white and blacks needed care.
For them, the National Foundation funded the Infantile Paralysis Center at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama.
They took me straight to Tuskegee after the initial examination.
Some instances, children had to stay in the hospital from 6 months to 2-3 years. All of them from rural sections of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. People in the rural communities, they couldn't drive in here any time and visit them.
I was one of the lucky ones. My parents did come see me once a week, but most of the kids' parents never did. I don't know whether they were from further than I were they poorer than I, but they never had visitors. I remember that. Very few.
In this White House, polio hit a child so hard, she is forever beyond the need of iron lung or crutch or brace. And here, too, death came through the closed door. 3 deaths on 2 blocks. 18 families fled from their homes in 1 week in a pitiful, useless effort to escape polio. Neighbor running away from neighbor. It did no good. It never does.
Basil O'Connor found himself facing hopeless statistics. In 1933, there had been 5,000 new cases of paralytic polio. 10 years later, that figure was more than double. Then, in 1946, 25,000 new cases. 1948, 27,000. 1950, 33,000. O'Connor's bottom line had become simply to stop the next epidemic. There were 2 leading approaches: killed virus vaccine and live virus. The leading proponent of killed virus was the young Jonas Salk. He had gained great understanding of the killed virus approach through his work on influenza. He came to the University of Pittsburgh and applied these same techniques to polio. In Cincinnati, Albert Sabin was developing a live virus vaccine. This method was the one favored by most medical opinion. Each approach had its advantages. Killed virus could be developed faster. Scientists already knew how to kill a virus. Live virus vaccine might take longer to perfect. No one knew how much to weaken the virus and still provide immunity. And the live virus vaccine had a substantial public health benefit. The weakened virus passed from the person who took it into the environment and could provide immunity to many others. All along, vaccine research meant infecting and then dissecting monkey after monkey. Cultivating the virus in live animals was a tedious and frustrating task. The monkey supply was limited and seemed unlikely ever to produce enough usable virus to make vaccine for mass distribution. In Boston, Dr. John Enders and his colleagues made a breakthrough discovery that made virus production far easier. From their work on chickenpox and mumps, they discovered how to grow poliovirus in test tubes, using a broth made of monkey kidney. Now, 1 monkey could be used to supply hundreds of portions of virus. By 1951, after 3 years of meticulous work, Salk and others had proved there were 3 types of poliovirus. And now he had Enders' methods for growing them. He immediately adapted his lab for an all-out push to a vaccine.
Now, it is true that Enders threw a long forward pass, and we happened to be at the place where the ball could be caught.
Jonas's approach to things was really kind of dual. On the one hand, he was a perfectionist, and that meant that details on the way toward the solution of a problem were extremely important, and if he got all the details right, the solution would reveal itself. The other side of him was the intuitive side. So it was a combination of an extremely logical mind with these intuitive flashes.
Researchers still used monkeys to see if a vaccine would build antibodies. But monkeys are monkeys. The real test was whether the vaccine would work on humans, young humans, children. The mistakes of the 1930s had not been forgotten. No one was going to inoculate children again without being absolutely sure it was safe. In spite of the growing number of polio cases nationally, local doctors and public health officials would frequently find themselves unprepared when it came to their town.
All of a sudden, I received a phone call from the university hospital, and they said that they had just heard that a polio case was coming in from the north part of the state, and they only had 6 isolation beds at the university hospital. And it was the only hospital in the state that would accept polio patients at the time. Before the day was out, we had had several other phone calls, and before 2 days had gone by, all 6 of the isolation beds at the university hospital had been filled. Everybody was afraid of polio, and they were afraid of contagion in the hospital. They were afraid of what effect this would have on other patients. They were afraid of the effect it would have on potential patients. So in a matter of 3 days, nurses were arriving, physical therapists were arriving, and equipment was arriving. And so we had, in a matter of 1 week, we had a working polio ward in Baptist Hospital. The fear of doing nothing was made greater than the fear of polio.
It's the pride of Ohio, a marching band. And in the little town of Wapakoneta, the high school band marches with a purpose, to meet a member who waits quietly inside this house. Inside this iron lung, Carol Hicks.
Saw this giant machine. To me, it was giant, and they always slid it open. There's a tray inside. Put me on it. Slid my hand through. I thought it was silly at the time because it took about 3 people to carry me.
I had to have somebody there by the respirator to feed me because I couldn't, of course, reach my mouth. So someone would sit on a little stool beside the respirator. And usually they'd feed 2 patients at a time.
I had claws around my neck to keep my neck from getting rubbed away by the collar. And one day, it was starting to hurt and it slid, but it took at least 2 people to fix it because I couldn't breathe on my own very well at all. So people had to work fast. Called the nurse. She came in. She seemed really frustrated, overworked, and just too busy. So I told her what was wrong, and she just told me to stop crying. She said she'd turn my respirator off if I didn't stop crying.
In the iron lung, it wasn't a period of rest. There was so much to do. I mean, I had 2 nurses a shift, 6 nurses a day, around the clock for 3 months. And we were all busy, and we were all busy fighting to save my life.
Hold your breath for a moment. What if you couldn't breathe again? This boy can't for very long without an iron lung.
Some children were crippled by polio, couldn't walk. Some couldn't breathe on their own. Some children died.
They let us go in and see him in the lung. Yeah. And we would sit outside and listen to it pumping, and then they'd say, well, you need to go home, that there's no change. So then they'd call us and we'd come back again and go see him and wait.
And I remember my sister telling me, don't say anything to Mom about Richard. And so I remember saying, Mom, where's Richard?
I guess I wanted so desperately for him to be well. So I told him that when he came home for Christmas, I would see that he got a fire truck.
I remember seeing Richard in the iron lung. He looked so small.
The fellow from the post office who took our phone calls came and told us that he had passed away.
I remember my parents talking about the funeral, but I remember them being very upset that there were not a lot of people that came.
People didn't want to come around, you know. How did they know where it came from?
During epidemic summers, waves of children came to the hospital door. The doctors were called. By now they knew polio well, how it worked and how impossible it was to stop. Undetected, the virus moves from the intestines to the bloodstream and into the nervous system. There, it attacks the cells that send messages from the brain to the muscles. The messages stop. The muscles go dead.
As the warm weather would come on, we'd start receiving 5 to 7 to 10 patients per day.
Then once you knew you were dealing with polio, then you had to assess what kind of paralysis the person had, or if they didn't have any, what to expect. And then the worst part of the whole thing came, and that's when you had to talk to parents.
There was no treatment other than supporting respiration, swallowing, food, water, hot packs.
It was a total emergency, day and night, day after day after day. This went on for weeks.
You could not touch the floor. You could not, if you dropped a pen, you could not pick it up. It's very common for the ladies to come in, sit down in a chair, and put their purse on the floor. And everybody would jump. Don't touch it. They would not allow them to pick it up. Somebody would have to pick it up and clean it.
We were all concerned as heck about it, our wives and our kids, because we would bring it home. 2 of my kids had polio, but fortunately with no paralysis. But I'm sure I brought it home to them.
6 out of 8 children is the toll taken by polio in this very nice California family.
I was the first in our family to get polio.
We came home and Don says, "Mom, I can't hardly walk either."
Then Mom came in and really felt my head and said, "You're burning up." I have a twin, Bob, Robert, and I had polio and he didn't.
I remember Dick went to the hospital, but then before they knew what was even going on with Dick, they took Don too.
So we got him all bedded down, and so I said, well, I have to run home and see if the others are okay.
And then Patty got polio.
When I went to the hospital, it was, they also took my brother David, who was 9 months old.
Patty would say, I want to go and see Don, and I said, well, you can't. You have to stay right here.
I felt that since I was the first to get it, that I had infected my other siblings. And then Audrey got polio.
I didn't want to tell Mother that I wasn't feeling good because 2 of them had already gone.
And I'd go from one to another.
And then Shirley got polio.
And there weren't enough beds. So they put me in a crib, and I was really angry. Bob and Carol, they said, well, we feel good, Mom, and we'll stay here and wait and take care of the house.
I used to just stand and look at the window all day and wait for him to come home, and it seemed like, months would go by, and they didn't.
Here in Middletown, New York, a typical American town is caught in the fearful, silent grip of infantile paralysis. School closed because of polio. School closed. School closed. Schools closed needlessly because of fear. It didn't do any good. It never does.
The school called to find out, or to tell my parents that everything I had in my locker was gone. And that if I had personal things in my locker, they had burned them. And they had burned my desk. and they had burned all my school books, and they had fumigated my locker.
The neighbors and the people who really knew about us in the neighborhood, I think were so afraid of the polio epidemic that they kind of treated us as though we had leprosy.
My mother got a number of calls from people that questioned whether there's some awful sin besides original that caused this bolt out of the blue to strike my family.
I was supposed to wash the bedroom up top to bottom with Clorox, and I had taken the crib out on the front porch and I was washing it. And the gas man came, to fill the barrels. And he said, "Oh, hi, Mrs. Howard, how are you this morning?" And I said, "Oh, I'm okay." And he said, "What are you doing?" And then I explained the whole situation with polio, and he just raised his arms up and he said, "Oh my goodness," and he left. And I think part of that is because he had 2 children of his own, and that's understandable. Yeah. But it did make you feel rather, sort of strange and lonely. Yeah.
In 1952, there were 59,000 new cases of polio, adding to the thousands crippled in previous years.
The biggest problem that the March of Dimes had as the survivors list began to grow was the fact that the March of Dimes had always given a blank check to the people who went to the hospitals. In other words, you didn't have to sign anything. If you had polio, they accepted you and they sent the bill to the March of Dimes. And this began to be a real financial burden as time went on.
A dream? No. Mark this well. This porch light and thousands like it can mean this: more money from more people collected in just 1 hour. A modern miracle of fundraising. You can do it through the Mother's March on Polio. It's an old gimmick with a new twist. It's a house-to-house canvassing with showmanship. It's collecting money from every family in town in 1 hour and doing it by personal invitation, the invitation of the lighted porch light. Besides, Mother's March is a show with a star, and that star is Mother, the very same mother who has so many things to do around the house that she feels she has no spare time to help in any cause except this one. No mother is too busy to give 1 hour to Mother's March on Polio. The hour right after dinner, the hour from 7 to 8.
Please help. Won't you please join my mommy in the Mother's March on Polio?
Fight polio tonight with your porch light at 7. Let the marching mothers know you're waiting for them.
And the theme was this: if you want to contribute towards fighting polio, turn on your porch light. So at 7 o'clock throughout the county of San Diego, people that wanted to give to the March of Dimes turned on their porch lights. And those are the only places that were called upon. Church bells were ringing. Several fire stations would blow their horns to make the noise that this was the hour.
The victims were children, their children. The vaccine would be their vaccine. The fear that had once driven Americans apart was now the force that pulled them together. Everything needed money. The survivors, their wheelchairs, iron lungs, braces, monkeys, test tubes, and posters. The March of Dimes made the poster child part of history.
I met
Patricia Crowley, an actress who was a starlet then, and I remember vividly she was pouring just a bunch of dimes into my skirt.
During the Mother's March, I'd get a story call from the newspaper. They could do a picture story. I felt obligated, and I felt really strange about it because they were using me to elicit sympathy so people would part with their money.
Everyone was enlisted in Basil O'Connor's crusade.
Hi-ho, research the win we know. If we all pitch in, we're bound to win with a hi. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. We'll lick the polio with dimes and quarters and our dollars, ho. Hi-ho.
Hello there. I am Zsa Gabor, and this is my little daughter Francesca. Hello.
You remember what it means to be a child, just as I do. And you know that in a child's world, there's no room for polio.
And there are a lot of parents whose children are healthy and happy now, who live in fear. I know I do.
We can't stop the fight until victory is complete, for polio knows no truce. Nearly $47 million are needed to continue the fight this year. So when you get this March of Dimes coin card in the mail, fill it in and turn it in quickly, won't you?
Please don't be offended if I preach to you a while. Is there out of place in eyes that...
While eliminating polio had for years been O'Connor's passion, one day it became his obsession. His daughter, Betty Ann, a young mother of 5, called and said, "Daddy, I've got some of your polio."
I was scared to be around children who were crippled.
She had that Frankenstein walk.
They're like medieval torture devices.
You could hear the scrape of his crutch.
They were immobile.
You see these big machines and people's heads sticking out of them.
This could have been you.
Well, when I came back from Sheltering Arms Hospital, I got together with some of my friends. They were looking forward to working for the city. So we went down to the village hall and I talked to the foreman and I said, well, you usually hire teenage boys and I'd like to work this summer also. He said, well, what do you think you can do? I said, well, you paint the streets every summer. I certainly could paint the curbs and paint lines for the parking sections. It was sort of a teamwork deal where we worked together on it. Worked well.
As I was going down the street, a little girl passed me, and she crossed herself as she passed me. And I thought, oh, she feels pity. And I wanted to go home right then. I mean, I wanted to go back to the hospital room. I wanted to hide.
My baby brother, I'd spent a lot of time with him. I'd read to him and play. I had to get reacquainted with him. He had to get reacquainted with me.
One of my parents, older sister and brother, would carry me every place I needed to go because I didn't have a wheelchair. So, and they would bring my dinner to me so I didn't have to go to the dinner table with the rest of the family.
Initially, my friends came often, and then they stopped coming so frequently. And I think it was partly that they ran out of things to talk to me about.
Junior high school kids are very cruel. And they used to call me Limpy and Crip.
What I needed to do is to arrange to have my friends grab the wheelchair and carry me up and down the steps to my classes.
When the other kids went off to school, I did nothing.
There were just a whole bunch of things that I wasn't going to be involved in. And certainly sports was one, any physical activity, dating. I mean, I was a cripple. Who's going to go out with a cripple?
In spite of Jonas Salk's confidence in his research, he still agonized over many questions. Did he really know how long killed virus immunity would last? What if it wore off and left children who got it at risk all over again? What if his vaccine somehow interfered with the normal immune system, leaving children even more exposed to the disease than before? What if the fluid that held the virus resulted in terrible allergies or cancer? And yet he knew he was close. As Salk moved rapidly towards his killed virus solution, Albert Sabin grew increasingly agitated. He patronized Salk, and Salk in turn could be brash towards Sabin and others in the medical establishment. They weren't in competition. Each had his own approach. But their relationship was taking on an ever harder edge.
The argument had to do with which one had the most lasting immunity. And Basil O'Connor said, I'm not interested in the most lasting immunity. I'm interested in something that will stop the next epidemic. The March of Dimes is not a science organization waiting until they get a perfect solution. If we can stop epidemics now, then we have a moral obligation to do that.
Here you see pictures of happy, healthy children anywhere USA. Helping to protect them is the purpose and goal of the March of Dimes. But we must face the fact that any one of these could be the next victim of infantile paralysis.
The societal fear of polio affected his research in the sense that that's the motor that was driving him, and that his determination to do something to alleviate that fear, the necessity for that fear, the cause of that fear, was always foremost in his mind. Nothing could possibly have put more pressure on Jonas than he put on himself. The 3 kids and I were lined up in the kitchen. Now, this would be at that point a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 10-year-old lined up, and me at the end, and he gave me a shot in the arm first and then went down the line and gave it to the kids, and that was all.
Our parents came and said, here, this is something that's going to be good for you. It will help you. And we were given the vaccine.
Salk now took an important next step. He went to a nearby institution and gave the patients his vaccine. Then he checked their blood to see if the injection had increased their antibodies.
Jonas Salk in 1951 came down to Watson Home and was talking to Miss Fletcher, and he asked if he could get permission to have the parents give him permission that he could check them, do the antibodies on them, and try his Salk vaccine on them. He'd go home and come back just to check the children and see if everything was all right, so that there weren't any reactions. And he could have called them on the phone and checked, but not Jonas. He had to come back and do it personally.
Although sure of his work, he nevertheless admitted, when you inoculate children, you don't sleep well for 2 or 3 months.
He knew the vaccine was good. He knew it was safe. And we who were around him realized the same thing, and certainly after what he'd done with my patients down there, I said, boy, this is the greatest thing since the wheel has been invented.
And no one looked over Jonas Salk's shoulder as he perfected his vaccine. Not the federal government, not the press, not his peers. No one. Then, in January of 1953, he traveled to an exclusive polio conference and presented a scientific paper entitled Studies in Human Subjects on Active Immunization Against Poliomyelitis. The title may have looked routine, but the full import of his work immediately dawned on Sabin and everyone else. Jonas Salk had tested children. Over the next year, he pressed O'Connor hard for the real test. a massive field trial with children from all over the country. Sabin protested. O'Connor hesitated. How could they possibly move forward? Yet how could they not? And what about all those nagging what-ifs? Finally, O'Connor ended an uneasy silence of indecision. He looked up during one of the many interminable meetings and said, "This coming summer, 30 or 40,000 children will get polio." The field trial was on.
Dr. Francis from University of Michigan is the one who was given a grant by the March of Dimes to conduct this field study. And Dr. Francis said he would accept it only if he was in charge of all the protocols. In other words, this is not another March of Dimes promotion. This is a scientific study.
Opposition to the trials increased. Sabin went to Congress to testify against it. He wrote to Salk that the killed virus vaccine was potentially unsafe. Others were more alarmist.
Before the field trial started, by the way, Walter Winchell came out with a scary report and said, all America, ships at sea, or whatever he used to say, click, 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 listen to this. Children are about to start getting this vaccine, which can be a killer. Of course, the fear was so great that the likelihood that you're going to finally put an end to this disease drove a lot of parents to say, yes, hurry up, do it.
Never had there been a medical trial to match the field trials of spring 1954. A Gallup poll showed that 9 out of every 10 Americans knew about it. It was the event of the school year. $20,000 doctors, 40,000 nurses, 50,000 teachers, and 200,000 volunteers picked up vaccines, delivered to children, wiped their tears, and distributed the lollipops. Polio pioneers. Not one of them knew who got the real vaccine and who didn't. Only the summer of 1954 would prove Jonas Salk right or wrong. All this time, the federal government was nowhere to be found. The National Foundation needed no license to do these tests. Afraid the time would be short before the polio season of 1955, the National Foundation borrowed money and ordered $9 million worth of Salk's vaccine. And all this was before anyone knew for sure if the vaccine worked.
Speaking to you from the control room of Studio 41 is the editor of See It Now, Edward R. Murrow.
Good evening. This is a polio program without any appeal for funds. It might be called an interim report on this vaccine. Last year, school children got this in their arm. Another 200,000 got placebo, an inert substance that has no effect whatever. Neither the children nor the parents knew who got the vaccine and who got the placebo. Other than inspecting all vaccine made, Dr. Jonas Salk had nothing whatever to do with the experiment. Dr. Thomas Francis of the Evaluation Center at the University of Michigan conducted the experiment. The results are still being measured, evaluated, and tabulated.
Hundreds of thousands of punch cards and endless statistical tables, and only one real question. O'Connor knew what to do if it worked. He knew what to do if it didn't. But what would happen if it only worked some of the time? And then, on the 10th anniversary of the death of President Roosevelt.
This is Tuesday, April 12th, 1955. a day which may well mark the most significant event in all of medical history. This is Ann Arbor, Michigan. During the past few months, the results of last year's mass trial of Dr. Jonas Salk's anti-polio vaccine has been evaluated. And here today on this same campus, before a select group of invited guests, the press, Dr. Thomas Francis Jr. will present his report on that evaluation. The world will very soon know whether the battle against the disease that has twisted hundreds of thousands of young bodies has been won.
About 500 scientists and health directors had been invited to attend, and must have been 500 news people or maybe 1,000. They're all over the place.
All the press were invited, but not any of the press had the slightest idea as to what was going to take place, what kind of announcement was going to be made.
On this basis, it may be suggested that vaccination was 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
And newsmen were jumping over each other and screaming, "It works, it works, it works." The whole place was bedlam.
And it was a bombshell. It was called many times a shot heard around the world.
Americans wanted a hero, and they had it in Jonas Salk.
And when we got home, the world had changed, and I must say, from our point of view, not for the better. Jonathan, who was aged 5 at the time, walks into the house, and after he'd put down his things or something, goes over to the telephone, calls up his friend Billy, and we hear him, both Jonas and I hear him say, "Hi, Billy, I'm back from my vacation, and I'm famous, and so is my dad."
When I think of the countless thousands of American parents who are hereafter to be spared the annual epidemic of poliomyelitis, I have no words in which adequately to express the thanks of myself, all the people I know, and all 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the other people in the world that will profit from your discovery. I am very, very happy to end that.
Science had saved the children, American science. And who owned this discovery? Salk said simply, "I say it belongs to everyone. I mean, could you patent the sun?" At 10 a.m. on April 12, 1955, Thomas Francis had made the announcement that the Salk vaccine is safe and effective. By 5:30 that afternoon, the federal government issued the license for mass distribution.
I remember when my son got the shot. I thought, this is the day I've waited for.
And then, 2 weeks into nationwide vaccination, some children who had received the Salk shots came down with polio. All vaccination came to a halt. It was discovered that 9 lots of the killed virus vaccine produced at the Cutter Laboratories in California were faulty. 400,000 children had received injections that potentially contained live virus powerful enough to give them polio. By the time the defective vaccine filtered throughout America, 204 children, their siblings and playmates, contracted the disease. 50 children lay paralyzed. 11 were dead. Nationwide vaccination did resume. The Cutter incident, however, cast a shadow over the elation felt but 2 weeks before. And Jonas Salk worried that the public's confidence in him and the vaccine would be shaken. For Salk, time was curiously out of joint. He was blamed by senior scientists like Sabin and Enders for the publicity-ridden, undignified atmosphere of the trials. They dismissed him as a mere technician. No new science in a killed virus vaccine. John Enders and his team won the Nobel Prize. Jonas Salk's colleagues would not even accept him into the National Academy of Science. With Salk's vaccine, the number of polio cases plunged. 80% in 2 years. But some people weren't getting their shots. Just the existence of the Salk vaccine had released fear. People felt safe again. They were not. Scattered epidemics flared up in 1958 and 1959. Was it too much to expect everyone in America to be vaccinated? Maybe the killed virus vaccine wasn't the answer after all.
There's no question that the Salk vaccine, which could be developed first, has prevented thousands of cases of paralytic poliomyelitis. But the situation now is not merely of a choice between one kind of automobile and another with some slight variations, but with an entirely new kind of vaccine, which is not only simpler to take because it can be given by mouth, but because it possesses properties and capabilities for the complete elimination of the disease that the other vaccine does not.
Albert Sabin's work was still being supported by the National Foundation, and finally, he was ready to test his live virus vaccine. He needed a population that had never been vaccinated, living in a place known to have polio. Russia. There had been epidemics of polio there since the start of the century. Even in the depths of the Cold War, Soviet doctors contacted Sabin. In 1959, they invited him to help set up a huge program of giving his oral vaccine. Sabin knew that if this program succeeded, the U.S. Public Health Service would have to take note and consider live virus vaccine for distribution in America. In the next 2 years, 77 million Russians took the live virus vaccine. It was judged a success by World Health experts. In 1961, the American Medical Association endorsed its use in the United States. Sabin on Sunday, it was called, and within 5 years, the oral vaccine had replaced the Salk shots as the preference of doctors and public health officials. In North America today, the crippler poliomyelitis has been eradicated. We inoculate nearly every American child with either the killed or live virus vaccine beginning in the first months of life. We have learned how to defend ourselves. We have learned how to live without that fear. For most of us, the fear is so far in the past that it is surprising to learn that polio epidemics continue to plague many parts of the world. But they do, and human beings continue to live unprotected and afraid. Only now are there efforts to eradicate the virus from the face of the earth. Decades after the Salk shots and Sabin Sundays. It means inoculating every child, from the most populous city to the most remote village in every country across the globe. With this, the virus poliomyelitis and the fear that it carries with it can finally be put to rest. The world has become much too small for polio.
For me, it was too little too late. But I was so grateful. I was so grateful that no one else would have to go through this.
I think any person would say, why me? You know, at that time, I had 7 sisters and brothers. And we were very close. I mean, we even slept in the same bed. And I always wondered, why me?
Sure, I'd like to walk. You know, I never carried, obviously, my bride across the threshold, and I was too big for her to carry me, so that didn't happen.
When I almost died, and I had all that pain, I learned a lot of things about life and what's important and what isn't. Everybody learns it, but usually it takes a lifetime. I learned it in a period of days.
In the 20th century, polio came and transformed America. The fear it produced turned us against one another and then turned us towards a cure. Now we have forgotten polio. All that remains are the life stories of the survivors. Their memories are the legacy of what was once that paralyzing fear.